Hi! We all know that it's really important to learn the English language. And in learning this, we have to master the macro skill. But how do we even assess and teach these macro skills? Well, you will find out here in this video as I am going to discuss to you and have a review regarding the course, teaching, and assessment of macro skills. When we learn a language, it's very important that we first hone our macro skills before achieving effective and accurate communication to each other. There are actually 4 macro skills originally, but as time goes by, it actually evolved into 5. These are reading, listening, viewing, speaking, and writing. These macro skills are actually divided into 2 categories. We have the expressive macro skill and the receptive macro skill. Well, the receptive macro skills are those I have mentioned, the first 3, which are listening, reading, and viewing. Now, for the expressive or the rest, which are speaking and writing. Whenever we talk about expressive, it's more of giving an output, producing or generating something out of what you've seen. And then for the receptive type of macro skill, it's more of the input, like you are giving yourself information regarding something for you to express it. Receptive macro skill is the ability to understand what is being provided to us. However, for expressive macro skill, it is the ability to communicate. Receptive macro skill comes first before we even try to have a good expressive macro skill. That's why whenever we try to write, our teacher tells us, oh, you have to read a lot. And then whenever we wanted to speak, our teacher will tell us, you have to watch more videos about speaking or listen to some of the speeches you see online. Remember, it will be very difficult for you to hone your communicative skills if you do not first improve your receptive skills. There is actually this one theory that anchors this macro skill, and this is no other than communicative competence, a term coined by Delheims in 1972. Well, communicative competence refers to the learner's ability to use the language with appropriateness, with cohesion, and appropriate strategies. Communicative competence includes linguistic competence, wherein you have the idea about the rule or you're familiar with the rules of the language. Second is that the social-linguistic competence, knowing where and what form of language you have to use in that certain setting. The third is the discourse competence, wherein you can understand and comprehend a whole discourse, like in a conversation or maybe reading a novel. Last but not the least is the strategic competence, like you avoid having dead air and knowing how to cope in a certain communication. Now, let's move on into the 2 forms as to how macro skills are being taught. There are actually 2, which is the BICS and the CALP. BICS stands for Basic Interpersonal Communication Skills, while CALP stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency. How are they different? Well, for BICS, it's more of learning the language beyond the classroom. It's like highlighting natural communication, more of the descriptive grammar. So they are not so strict in terms of implementing the rules, as long as it can be understood and they are using the language effectively. However, with a CALP, it's not like that. Its goal is to actually teach the students how to use the language proficiently in the academic sense, meaning you have to use the language accurately. They are more strict in terms of implementing the rules. It focuses on the ability to read, to write, to analyze a paper, and so on, that can be used in business industry and so forth. However, for the BICS, it highlights more the social context. Like, if you are in this place, you have to communicate in this way. Or if you were in this certain scenario, you have to communicate it like this. Well, it's more likely used in a vocational field wherein they don't really need to be really proficient in the language as long as they can be understood well. I'm going to show you now the quadrants as to how we teach the BICS and the CAL. As you see on the upper portion, we have the cognitively undemanding because it's BICS, and in the lower portion, it's cognitively demanding. Okay, then on the left side, we have here context embedded, meaning it's more likely that they dwell on the context. Context reduced, it's very academic in a sense. So we also have the examples as to how BICS and CAL teach the language. So in teaching Macroskill, it's also important that we use both of this so that we can target the social context scenario and at the same time the academic field. After the forms, we will now be moving on with the approaches as to how we should be teaching Macroskills in general. First off, we have content-based instruction. Whenever we talk about content-based instruction, just remember this word, integration. Like you integrate the English language to other subjects. For example, TLE, you want them to cook something and then using the English language, they are going to instruct the people as to how to cook it. So see, integration, content by content. The next, we also have here communicative language teaching. This one highlights more natural communication as to how to effectively deliver your message to other people in a different context using different strategies. The third, we also have personal growth approach, and this is more affective centered because the students' experiences are highlighted. It's making your learning meaningful by making the students' observation and what's happening around them. It's like they grow along with the macro skill. Last but not the least is the cultural model approach. Well, most probably you heard it with literature teaching, but it can also be applied in language or maybe in the macro skill teaching. We highlight the culture and as to how we learn the language, for example, how we write, how we speak, how we pronounce a word, and it's backed up with the culture that we are in and in the society we are living with. Practice time. This one is like a bonus here in my video. I am going to present drills regarding what I've discussed just to check if you really learned something. You can skip and continue to our next discussion, but you can also pause and try answering. Now, let's start dwelling with the 5 macro skills. Let's start off with the part 1, which is the reading skill. So, what is reading? How do we know that we are really reading? According to Brown, 2004, reading is a process wherein we decode the text, we try to comprehend it, and later on, interpret it. Another definition, according to Widowson, 1990, it is a process of negotiating. Like you have your insights already in your head, activating your schema, and that material is already giving something to you. There is a dialogue between the reader and the writer. There are 2 theories or maybe approaches in teaching reading. We have the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. It might be confusing at first, but just remember this one. Whenever we talk about top-down approach, look at that. Top, it's more of your brain first and then everything follows. Therefore, you already have the idea as to what you are reading. You already have the inferences. You already have the clues regarding it. Now, with the bottom-up approach, meaning you come from nothing. You don't have any clue about it. So when you read that, it's first letter by letter, sound by sound, until you form a word into sentences. It's like building blocks until you form a complete discourse. Now, when do we usually apply this one? Usually, for the bottom-up approach, we apply it with a first time text that we encounter. For example, it's your first time reading a research and you don't have any idea about it, so you read the abstract. So one by one, you look at the process of doing the research. However, for the top-down approach, it's most likely with the text you are already familiar with. Or maybe you can have a clue, like short stories, the novels. For example, if you see a lady with a wolf, like that, you already have the picture in you about the lady and the wolf. Let's try this picture that we have. What text do you think is the top-down approach? Or should we use a top-down approach? And what text should we use a bottom-up approach? Alright, that's good. So, text A, as you see, it's more of a manual. Remember, whenever we handle a manual and it's our first time using that manual, most probably we have to follow it step by step and read it carefully. However, for the text B, it's a short story and we have to see the title inside the house, like we already have an idea what will happen. So that will be a top-down approach and text A will be a bottom-up approach. Whenever we teach reading, it's very crucial that we tell our students the purpose why they read. So I'm going to give you 4 once you already have your readers. First, we read for awareness. Second, we read to learn the language. Third, we read for cultural knowledge. And fourth, we read for content information. I'm going to show you some principles to follow once you teach reading. First, we use techniques and content that are intrinsically motivating. This is very important because if they see that your technique is just a traditional one and not new, how they're going to be motivated? Even your content, if it's inevitable that your content might be too hard or too boring for them, why not make that technique a better one? Second, you both include bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. The more, the better. Why? It's because they are engaged with more activities and they are exposed with more scenarios in terms of reading. Third, you balance the use of authentic materials. For example, newspapers, research, brochures, and other stuff like that. You also need to use the textbook itself so that they know how to skim and scan and to even process the words there. Speaking of this principle, we have this what we call peer-assisted reading method. It is really natural that we will encounter students that have difficulty in reading, maybe because of their low IQs or they're not really exposed well with the reading. So, it's very good idea once you pair them up with someone who can read. It's like you save more of your time and energy, and at the same time, you highlight more the collaborative approach in teaching. So, it's like the good student or your good reader teaching the students who have difficulty in reading. Last but not the least, you can subdivide the techniques into 3. Not just a one-day teaching or one process teaching of reading. You can make it into pre-reading, while reading, and post-reading. That's why in doing a lesson plan for reading, these 3 are very crucial. Okay, class, get 1/4 sheet of paper. And then your students will tell you, huh, mom? 1/4? 1/4, mom? Well, this one is the common problems that we face whenever we talk about listening. So the thing is, what is really listening? Are these students that we have are really listening? Let's define this one. According to Emmerich 1994, listening is beyond hearing the words. It is an active process, not a passive one, unlike most of us believe. Ma'am, the question is, why is it active? I think every time when I walk somewhere, I hear it. Well, hearing and listening are different things, so I hope we are not confused about it. Whenever we talk about hearing, it's about you hear the sounds, you perceive whatever sounds, but you don't actually mind it. But for listening, it's more than hearing the sounds, you try to process it. Let's try to take a look with the process of listening. First, we have receiving. This is what we also call as hearing. Second is the understanding. We try to process that one. Third, we have remembering. It's like, yes, you understand it, but is it retained? For the fourth, you evaluate. Meaning, you judge, you critique what you hear. Is it right or wrong? Last but not the least is the responding. It's your reply. Regardless if you say something or not, if you just nod, if you just ignore it intentionally, even though you understand it, it could also be considered as a response or a feedback. So, given this process, we could say that it's not really a passive one because it takes a lot of effort to listen to someone. We listen according to our purpose. So there are actually different purpose in listening. First, we have information. It's like what you're doing right now. You are listening to what I am telling you because we are reviewing this course. Second, instruction. So instruction is more of you follow a direction. Like I ask you, can you please answer these practices? And then you follow. So that's listening for instruction. Third, listening for evaluation. This is mostly used for debate or whenever your response is needed and you have to critically analyze a material. Fourth, you listen for pleasure. It's like you just listen to your favorite song, watching a movie, that's already for pleasure. And last but not the least is for empathy and for therapeutic purposes. Like you go counseling, or maybe you empathize to people, so you listen to them. Most of the teachers struggle in terms of making listening as a product. Yes, because how can we even make sure that our students are really listening, right? That's why we have here listening as a product. What are the activities we can do to ensure that they are actually applying listening skills in your class? First, we have following instructions, like you make them an activity wherein they have to listen to what you do, maybe doing a bird box edition of something, that's cool. Organizing and classifying information or even summarizing from the materials they've heard, that could also be another tip. Taking effective notes or like a dictation notes, like as simple as you wanted to read something and they write it, that's already a good listening skill. Transferring an information into a graphic form, like you ask them to watch something or to listen to a news and they have to create a table, a tabular data regarding that. Or maybe a simple oral recitation when you ask questions inside the class, that's already assurance that they are listening. You know, I've watched this in TED Ed and there's no actually a sign as to see if your student is really listening, but their intention to really listen. The nodding, it's not really that. Because sometimes students are just nodding but they're not really understanding what you're saying, right? So all you have to do is to make your listening material and your activities as fun as possible. At least you're getting their attention, and having their attention, they are actively learning and acquiring the listening skill. What are the barriers in listening? There are major factors that affect as to how our students comprehend something using their ears. First one, the physiological, the physical state. Maybe they have fever, maybe they're deaf. That will be a hindrance. Second, the psychological. They are physically normal, however, their mental state is not stable and not okay. Have you ever seen those students who are like tulala in your class? They're just staring at you, but they're not really listening to you. Third, their intellectual. For the intellectual, is more of their IQ, their capability to process what you are saying. Like for example, you talk fast as a teacher. So maybe there are students who can get along with your facing in speaking. However, there may be some slow learners in the class that's hard for them to decipher what you are saying. There is also what we call knowledge base. For knowledge base, this is what they already know. Like, for example, if I teach you right now how to do statistics, but you don't have a background in terms of algebra and some other things, it will be hard for you because you don't have a schema. That's knowledge-based. However, it's different from intellectual because intellectual talks about your IQ. Another important factor is the environmental. Is the class noisy during discussion? Maybe there are noises outside the classroom, like those things. It will affect the learning or the listening of the students. Last but not the least is your morality, like what you believe. This is very evident during the campaign period. Like, for example, if you follow a certain candidate, it's very hard for you to listen to other candidates' program because your belief is already closed. Like, you believe that this is the only one I wanted to listen to. So that's morality. We have here strategies in listening. It's like the same with our reading strategies. We also have the top-down and the bottom-up approach. Now, you're already familiar with the top-down and bottom-up. Let's just apply it in a listening scenario. Like, for example, you hear someone saying something, and if you already have a schema about it, it will be easier to decode what he or she is saying. So, it's top-down approach. However, for the bottom-up approach, for example, you wanted to follow how to cook adobo since it's your first time, so you listen intently step by step. Okay? Lastly, we also have a metacognitive strategy. It is the ability of the students to problem solve, to analyze a material that they listen to. It is about knowing what they will be doing with the listening material and actually comprehend it and interpret it. In having listening tasks inside the classroom, we still need to divide it into three. We have the pre-listening stage, the during listening, and of course, the post-listening. And now, we are already on the last part of our receptive skill. And at this point, we are going to discuss the newest macro skill, which is my favorite, viewing. In this era where social media is very evident and already a necessity, well, viewing is also an important skill to remember. What is viewing? Viewing is the process of attending and comprehending visual media such as television, advertising images, films, diagrams, symbols, whatever you view, it can be part of viewing. Why do we even include the viewing and not just dwell with the 4 macro skill? As you see, pedagogy is evolving. That's why even our strategies in teaching should also evolve. So right now, it's information overload and technology is there. Teachers always need visual aids and they're no longer using just a manila paper. There are also PowerPoints. You visiting here in our YouTube channel is already a step as to how you practice your viewing skill. You try gathering information not just inside the classroom, but you go beyond your classroom. Viewing becomes more interesting because of the materials that are improving. We already have the term called multimodal. Like, for example, when you read a book, it's not just text. These includes pictures or maybe graphs, images that will help you to comprehend more. Some examples of those multimodals are the drawings, photographs, videos, web pages, graphs, charts, and even the multimedia itself. So, how do we teach viewing? As what I've told you, this is one of my favorite macro skills to teach because it's very interesting to use it inside the classroom. These are some of the approaches in teaching viewing. First, we have the 3 C's and 3 S. So, the 3 C's, it stands for color, character, and camera. So, whenever you ask your students to watch something, you also ask them to take note how the camera moves, how it affects the plot of the story, the color, how it changes the mood, and even the character. You let them describe these characters that they see in the film or maybe in the video. These 3S stands for the setting, sound, and story. So of course, at the end, they have to know the plot, like what's happening entirely. Then the setting, where it took place, how it affected the plot, and of course, the sound. Just like in color, it creates a mood and a tone regarding each character that you have. Once the students were able to answer these three and how it affects the viewing, they are really manifesting the viewing skill. Second strategy is the visual thinking strategy. This one is developed by Abigail Hausen and Philip Yinowen. So what they do here is that they just observe a picture. By the way, this can be used whenever a student, for example, was presented with the picture and you go field trip, go to a museum and try to analyze a visual there. So they observe what's in the picture, they reflect about it, and they collaborate to one another about it. So that is visual thinking strategy. Last but not the least is the see, think, and wonder. This is probably used the same way how we view images or paintings or even photographs. Like you ask them to see it and then think about it, like what do you think of the setting, what is the message of this visual presentation, and lastly is to wonder, like moving their imagination about those pictures. So it's more of integrating their schema at the same time their interest into one. These are some strategies that we can use whenever you wanted to have viewing in your class. The 3 steps: before viewing, during viewing, and post viewing or after viewing. For the pre or before viewing, you need to define the purpose of viewing that. Make a preview, like a teaser. Ask them to predict what will happen in the movie, or maybe make connections to that. Now, while viewing a certain material, you can actually give them a guide questions, like clarifying something about their prediction a while ago, inferring, collecting clues about their predictions. Now, the last one will be after viewing. It consists of summarizing, analyzing, and even creating something out of the viewed material. Well, are you one of those students who really struggle in terms of speaking the language? It is very difficult to overcome a stage wherein you're very confident to speak the language. But, you know, if you practice and expose yourself more with the English materials, I'll tell you, you will improve in no time. This time, we're already done with the receptive skill. We will now moving on with the expressive skill, starting off with speaking. Speaking is the process of building and sharing meaning through the use of verbal and non-verbal communication. And we use it in a variety of contexts. Verbal refers to a written and oral language, while non-verbal refers to the gestures, your tone in speaking, your stress, your intonation. Now, speaking of the context, like speaking in different contexts, we have here the physical, the social, psychological, and the temporal context. The physical talks about the environment. Are you in a classroom, at home? Second, with a social, psychological, the status of the people around you. Who are you with? And last but not the least is the temporal, which is the time. Our speaking differs depending on time. Of course, you will not say good morning if it's night. There are actually 2 types for the purpose of speaking. The first one is transactional and the second is the interactional. Whenever we talk about transactional, it's more of a business thing. You can be talking to someone you are not really close with just for the sake of getting a specific information. In a business, of course, like you're negotiating your products to the seller or to the consumers. Then, for the interactional, the main purpose of this one is to build a bond or maybe a friendship. Maybe you are talking about nonsense things, but the thing is, you're close with that person and there is an affective factor with that situation. Just like in listening, there can be influencing factors as to why it is very difficult to speak the language. First one is the native language. Our first language as Filipinos is, of course, Filipino. Most of the rules in Filipino cannot be applied in English language, like kung anong sulat, siyang basa. It's very syllabic, but in English you can't do that. That's why our enunciation of words is sometimes hard, or how should I say this, very syllable per syllable. Second, your exposure with the language. Back when I was in high school, I am always exposed with Tagalog materials, so it's very difficult for me to speak the language because it's not a natural thing. Third, your innate phonetic ability. It is already in research that we have this innateness inside us, wherein each of us has our own capability of learning the language. Some may be very fast in terms of acquiring new language, but there are other people who are very slow learners in learning new languages. Fourth, we also have the age. Yes, it is backed up with research that age has something to do in terms of acquiring a language. Research says that younger learners tend to acquire more language inputs, while adults acquire lesser input, but most of them are comprehensive. Now, in connection with that is the identity and language ego. Well, sabi nga nila, kapag matanda daw, parang minsan nahihiya na in terms of learning the language. It's true. You're very afraid to mispronounce a word. Like, people are watching you and they're thinking if you have a wrong grammar or wrong usage of grammar, like you will falter and things like that. That's actually identity and language ego. You don't want them to be disappointed in your usage of language. But here's the thing, don't worry about that. You just have to learn and learn. After identifying the factors that affect our speaking, let us now go to the problems that we usually encounter whenever we have this skill. The first one is the clustering. Well, as what you see here, most of the students have difficulty in dividing the set of words, like when to pause and when to stop. Most of them usually pause word per word, which is incorrect. Whenever we do this, it has to be idea per idea. Second is the reduced form. It's like got to, it turns into gotta, and then want to into wanna. Most of us Filipinos have difficulty in acquiring the culture of reduced forms because we are very syllabicated. Another thing, the reduced form is not used in formal setting. Third is the colloquial language. Like, for example, instead of you saying a guy, you say dude. A good time, a ball, comfortable, easy, cushy. It's the term that is only used in that region. It's very cultural. Some of us that have different culture will struggle in terms of identifying what it means. There is also what we call performance variable. This of fillers, pauses, backtracking, corrections. Like, for example, you're saying, those are fillers. So, as much as possible, you have to avoid putting so much fillers on what you're saying because it's distracting, but you can pause. However, of course, not too much of a pause. That's why we have to practice. Instead of fillers, you put stops. The rate of delivery, is it too fast? Is it too slow? It has to be in an appropriate pacing wherein students could understand you. Rhythm and intonation also has something to do with the meaning you are creating while you are speaking. So this is also important. We avoid having a monotone. Last but not the least is our interaction. Yes, you can speak in English, you can recite, but can you really interact and converse with other people using the English language? It's another problem that most people encounter. Practice drill. Again, you may pause this part wherein you try answering, or you can proceed to the next discussion. For this portion, we are going to talk about how to teach speaking in the classroom. There are actually 4 types of speaking tasks. Let's start with the imitative speaking task. This is usually used in a primary school wherein you just repeat what the teacher is saying. Like for example, when the teacher says apple, then the students will say apple. It's more of repetition wherein students are just starting to build their knowledge in pronouncing the words. Second, we also have responsive speaking tasks. This usually happens in a recitation wherein the teacher asks a question and you respond. But this is structured. How? Well, it is structured in a way that you complete what the teacher is saying. Like for example, my name is, and then you answer. So that is responsive speaking task. There is a structure. It's different with intensive speaking tasks wherein, sure, it's also responsive, but it no longer has much of the structure unlike the responsive. Like the teacher will be asking you, what is your name? And then you will answer, my name is. So it's like that. This also include discussion among peers. Last but not the least will be the extensive speaking task. For the extensive speaking task, the teacher will be asking the students to create a whole discourse. Example of this are role-playing, reporting, news broadcasting, and other things. This time, I'm going to share to you the principles in teaching speaking. First, you have to provide something that learners need to talk about, which is interesting. Of course, they will not talk about it if they don't have a prior knowledge about it and they are not interested regarding the topic you have given. Second, that leads me to personalizing the speaking task activity, something that they can relate with and make them have a meaningful task to do. Third, you have to plan speaking tasks ahead of time that involves interactional and transactional purposes of teaching. The same with listening, of course. We have to make sure that our students are actually experiencing a lot of contextual speaking situations. Last but not the least is to highlight to the students the importance of speaking English language. Of course, you will not be an effective communicator if you cannot speak well. The same way, you also need to make them be natural in terms of making mistakes. That it's okay to make mistakes as long as they are learning about it. So yes, finally, we're done with the 4 and we will be now talking about the last macro skill, which is the hardest macro skill to teach and at the same time to do, the writing skills. Every time you ask the students to write an answer using an essay type of question, what do you get? Are you satisfied with their answers or they just give you a 1-sentence answer? Well, that's the common problem whenever we talk about the writing skill. What is writing? Well, writing is another medium of communication wherein we put our thoughts into symbols and text. A text, you have to make sure that there's no mistake in writing because you can double check it. This one is deeply reliant with all the macro skill, specifically the reading skill, because it will be very hard to produce a vocabulary or to construct sentences if you are not exposed with this type of languages. The same with listening, we also have the writing process. So what happens in writing? First, there is the pre-writing. You ask your students to draft something, anything that comes into their mind, like it's a free writing. Second, you tell them to plan and outline whatever their thoughts are. You ask them to organize it. Third, they started writing and creating a draft from that plan, like making it coherent and cohesive as well. Fourth, after producing that first draft, you will start to check it and see if there are some things you have to remove or maybe some things you have to add. Last but not the least is the proofreading. Proofreading is very different from revising because in revising, you will add some information or maybe remove some information. But with proofreading, you will no longer care about the idea because it's already polished. What you care about are maybe punctuations, grammar, or capitalizations in terms of writing. Now, let's talk about the different views in writing and as to how we conclude that this is the way we should be teaching. The first one is the cognitive process theory. From the word itself, cognitive, it deeply relies on our long-term memory in our schema. Therefore, you cannot write anything if you don't have any idea about that certain material. It includes planning, translation of what you know into the paper, and lastly is the reviewing of what you have written. Second theory, we also have here the social-cultural theory, which is based on Lev Vygotsky's scaffolding. This theory relies on the peers, like you don't actually need much of the schema if you have someone who can guide you in writing. However, these two theories are not enough. That's why we also have the third theory, which is the social cognitive theory. This is the combination of the two theories. It believes that schema is not alone enough to make the students write. It also needs a guidance from someone who knows how to write. Now, let's proceed with the different approaches as to how we teach English writing in class. First, there is what we call the rule-based approach. Rule-based approach is a very traditional approach in terms of writing because we focuses merely on the grammar. Teachers provide manipulated sentences that are full of errors and it's the student's responsibility to correct this. Well, this is somehow good because it's a form of practice, but the natural learning is not really there because everything is manipulated. Second, the process writing approach. In this way, the teacher is already highlighting the process as what I have discussed earlier. You wanted your students to run through as to how to write a certain paper. For example, you want them to write an abstract of research. Therefore, you first tell them, these are the contents you have to put. So there are actually planning and then you ask them to outline. So your mere focus with process writing approach is the process itself, not the product. You are grading them based on their progress during the writing. Third, we also have the genre approach. For the genre approach, you actually expose your students to different kinds of text. For example, you give them a poetry, then next day you give them a prose like drama, or maybe a formal academic papers like critic review and other things. So that's how genre approach occur because you want your students to be more familiar with different types of text around the world. We also have strategy approaches wherein it focuses on making your students be more familiar with the strategy in writing. Actually, this type of approach has a point because it's not that you're teaching them just the material, you're actually teaching them a lifelong skill they can use with other materials you haven't taught to them, right? Last but not the least will be the multimodal writing approach wherein you just not let your students write something but provide a different mode that supports their writing. For example, you ask your students to write a short story and alongside with the short story, you actually give them a picture where they can get inspired with the story they will be writing. Practice drill. So again, you may skip or pause for this one. Last thing that we have to know is how do we even assess writing? Well, I think it's already natural that you ask your students or you give your students topic and you ask them to write it and you check it. But how do we check it? I will be giving you some tips as to how to check writing outputs. Checking will be divided into two types. The first one will be for the initial stages and the second part will be for the culminating stage. First, For the initial stage, of course, it's the first time that the students encounter that type of activity for writing. So, your focus should primarily be on the idea and the content itself. You have to see if what they're saying in the writing is cohesive enough and very substantive. Also, in making comments, it should be just generalized. You're not pointing everything, like you're not pointing every mistake and putting a lot of red marks. Here's another thing, teachers, right now, we rarely use red ball pens in checking because it leaves trauma to our students. Why not use violet, blue, or other colors? So it will have less negative effects to our students. Then for the culminating stage, of course, this will be the time where you have to expect more. You already give them a chance to practice during the initial stages. So for the culminating stage, it's their time to give out their best as to what they have learned from your lesson, like applying every skill in terms of writing. That's why a teacher should comment specifically with the things they have to improve or maybe the positive things that you see or notice in their paper. You also need to call attention now with the incorrect grammatical usage because this is very important. It's already the culminating stage. Also with the expression and choice of words, maybe it's grammatically correct. However, there may be other phrases that could be used to make the writing better. You can also check on that. Designing assessment tasks is what we are going to talk with this part. There are actually 3 types of assessment tasks. The first one is imitative writing, wherein you just ask the students to copy everything they see on the board or maybe from a book. For example, the teachers will be writing the letter A cursive and they will also be writing the A cursive, like things like that. It's imitative, like repeating what they are actually doing. Second is the intensive or controlled writing. Yes, they already have the freedom to write, but not exactly free because you are limiting what they should be writing. This is more likely used in terms of filling in a biodata, doing a resume with a guided format, or maybe like fill in the blanks like I am blank, I live in blank, and so on and so forth. Last will be the extensive writing task. This is the part where you actually let your students do what they want using a certain task. For example, you ask them to do essay, paraphrasing, and even question and answer. Practice drill. I just wanted to know, how will you assess the students in terms of the given situation? You may pause or skip this one. Indeed, we really need to become an effective teacher for us to make our students learn more in classroom. It is already a stepping stone, knowing the concept how to teach, but the application will be a bit more challenging. Now, I just wanted to share to you the qualities of an effective teacher, that if you yourself will become future educator, make sure you have this following qualities. First, you need to have a subject matter knowledge. Of course, you cannot teach what you don't have. You have to master the English language. Specifically, if you will be teaching Macroskill, be proficient with these 4 or maybe 5. Second, pedagogical knowledge. It's not enough that you have the knowledge about what you will be teaching. It's also important that you know different methods, principles in teaching. That's why I am telling you some of the concepts, some of the tips, so you can apply it in the classroom. Third is the social affective skill. We need to have a heart. Of course, as a teacher, we will not be complete without having a heart towards our students. At the end of the day, we have to consider that every learner is different and we have to embrace them regardless. Last but the most important factor is their personality. Of course, every teacher is also different the same way the students are. Therefore, you have to know who you really are as a teacher. We are all different. You cannot expect that you will be like me, and I cannot expect you to be like other teachers. Okay, you have to form who you are, and that will make a perfect ingredients of an effective teacher. And ta-da! We're already done discussing the course, teaching and assessment of Macroskill. I really hope that you learned a lot from this 1 hour, I think, discussion. And yeah, I hope that this video is very helpful for you. So I'm hoping that you like and subscribe to our Flip channel so that you'll be updated more with more topics regarding your college life.